Dr. Behe, please tell us, what is your field of expertise and where did you get your PhD?
I'm a biochemist, and biochemistry is the science that studies the molecules of life, the very foundation of life. And I got my PhD in biochemistry at the University of Pennsylvania in 1978. My dissertation looked at sickle cell hemoglobin and how it helps to cause the disease, sickle cell anemia.
And at what point did you become a Darwin skeptic? I know that evolution is one of those topics that you're forbidden to question. You're told to accept. And in the field of academia especially. So how did you start to question Darwinism?
That's interesting. I was always taught that Darwin was right. I went to parochial schools and heard about it there in high school and college, of course, and I never had any problem with it. I figured that the Catholicism could live with Darwin's theory of evolution. But it wasn't until I was an associate professor at Lehigh University in the mid-1980s that I read a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis by a man named Michael Denton, who was a geneticist and medical doctor living in Australia. And he pointed out a whole lot of problems for Darwin's theory that I had never heard of, even though I was a professor of biochemistry. I'm supposed to know these things. And at that point, I became mad, angry, because I thought I was being led to believe something, not because of the evidence, but because that's just the way we're supposed to think these days. And so from then on, I became very interested in evolution. My previous research was not on evolution, it was on other things, but now I became interested in it. And one of the first things I did was to go to the science library and see who had explained some of the many very complex biochemical systems that you routinely study in biochemistry. The foundation of life is very complex, very elegant. I would look at it sometimes before reading this book and say to myself, gee, wow, I wonder how that evolved. And then I'd say, well, somebody probably knows, and I'd turn the page. But then I said, well, who has explained this? And I was astonished to see there are no papers in the science literature detailing in real terms how some of the very complex systems of life could have arisen by a Darwinian mechanism. And that's when I became very skeptical of Darwin's theory.
Can you please dig a little bit deeper into what you mean by complexity? I know that in some of your writings you illustrate your point with the mousetrap, and I have one here. So how does this little contraption make your point?
Okay, well, this mousetrap, as you can see, is complex in the sense that it has a number of different parts. And what's more, in order to perform its function, in order to catch mice, it needs all these guys. It needs all these parts. It's got this wooden platform, and it's got the spring here, and the spring has extended ends. It's not just a simple spring, it's got its end that hooks over this part, which is called the hammer, which is this part that actually catches the mouse. And it's got another extended end here to press against the platform. And it's got this extended thing that's called the holding bar, and that can hold the hammer, this part, in place until the mouse comes along. And there's a little thing called the catch here, which stabilizes the holding bar. Now, it turns out if any of these parts are missing, the trap doesn't work. So not only is it complex, it's what I called irreducibly complex. You can't take a part away and still have it work. If you took away this hammer, the mice don't get caught. Take away the spring or the holding bar, any of the pieces, it doesn't work. Now, the problem for Darwin's theory is that, number one, the molecular foundation of life is run by machines. The cell is run by actual machines made out of molecules. People find that fantastic, but hey, that's the way it is. There are little machines that act like outboard motors that can propel cells along, and other machines that carry cargo from one part of a cell to another. And those machines, just like pretty much any machine, and including the mousetrap, have a number of different parts performing different roles, and they're all needed for the machine to work. Darwin's theory of evolution requires that natural selection favor an organism that has a very small change that helps the organism do something better. So if we're taking that view of Darwinism, we can ask, how could something like this, something like a mousetrap, be put together one tiny step at a time? And it turns out it's surprisingly difficult. You know, if you just had the wooden platform, just the bottom, that doesn't catch mice. If you put on, say, this holding bar, you might say, well, maybe if a mouse is running along, it would trip on the platform and impale itself on the holding bar. But that's kind of just silly. So this can't be made gradually. So that's a big problem for Darwin's theory, because pretty much the foundation of life, these things are all over the place. And furthermore, you can ask yourself, well, how do we recognize intelligence? And it turns out that the way that we recognize intelligence is by what I call a purposeful arrangement of parts. And that's when different parts are put up in relationship to each other, where you can see that they have a purpose. That is, the arrangement has a purpose. An easy example are letters in a word. You know, people put the letters in to form a word, words to make a sentence, and so on. And not only is this arrangement, this can't be put together gradually, but we immediately see that the arrangement of these parts has a purpose. And so we immediately grasp the intelligence that was needed to produce something like this. And again, I can't emphasize enough that Darwin didn't know anything about the foundation of life. He and his contemporaries thought that the cell was a little piece of jello, protoplasm, they'd call it. And it was mysterious, you know, did cool stuff, but they didn't know how, so they pretty much ignored it. But modern science has shown that the cell is a lot like a ultra-sophisticated nanoscale factory, far, far beyond anything that humans could produce. And again, they're just chock full of machinery that is much more sophisticated than this simple little mousetrap. So not only have I become skeptical of Darwin, but you can readily see the design in life. So I've argued that many of these machines were purposefully designed.
It's a compelling argument for sure, especially when we observe in daily life, when we see something that was made, the first thing that comes to mind is it had to have had a maker. Mm-hmm. You know, if you were walking through the Amazon jungle and you saw a bicycle, you would automatically think, well, who left this bicycle here, right? Or how did it get here?
That's like William Paley's, around the year 1800, he's made a famous argument called the watchmaker argument, saying that if you found a pocket watch in a meadow as you were walking along, you would immediately know that it was purposely designed, because you see how the parts interact with each other, the gears and the hands of the watch and so on. And so when we see that purposeful arrangement of parts, we always perceive that there is a mind behind it, because only minds have purposes. And you don't even have to go to things like watches and bicycles. When I go out and talk to groups, I show a Far Side cartoon. It's a good cartoon series, very amusing. And there's one that shows a bunch of jungle explorers, a line of jungle explorers. And the lead explorer has been pulled up by a vine by his ankle, and all these kind of bamboo shoots come and skewer him. And one of the other explorers says to a third one that's why I never walk in front. And so, good advice. But the point is that anybody in the audience sees that the trap was purposely made, because you need the parts to be arranged just so for it to work. And that wasn't an accident. As a matter of fact, the humor of the cartoon depends on the audience recognizing the design. So again, that's how we recognize design and intelligence in a mind, and we see that everywhere in life, especially at its foundation.
What you're saying suggests that it takes too much faith to believe in Darwin, that the universe and the order that we can see in all these things at a very basic level presupposes order.
Right.
And presupposes a mind that made that order, created that order. And to think that Darwin, with just unguided, unplanned processes, explains everything, it takes too much faith.
Yeah, you can put it that way. And certainly a lot of people, it is a real matter of faith. That is, that they posit or they believe and will not be talked out of the assumption that there is nothing that could have made life on Earth, or that could have arranged the universe, the laws of the universe, and so therefore clearly it had to have happened by chance or such, or by a process such as Darwin's, because here we are, and and Darwin's is the only theory that's ever been advanced that has any shot at explaining such things as life. But you can be open. You don't have to take Darwin's theory as a matter of faith or design as a matter of faith. You could say, well, what does the evidence show? And I think back in Darwin's day, they didn't know much about life, and his idea was reasonable. And it was a good start. It was always a long shot, but hey, try it and see how far you can get. And it certainly does explain some things, Darwin's theory. For example, I said that my doctoral thesis was work on sickle hemoglobin. Well, it turns out sickle hemoglobin is a mutant of normal hemoglobin. And while it causes anemia in most people, in Africa, folks that have a mix of the sickle hemoglobin and normal hemoglobin genes, one from their mom, one from their dad, have a measure of immunity to malaria. So that helps. And you can explain that by a classic Darwinian mechanism. But the problem is it's just a tiny change in a pre-existing system, hemoglobin, and much more often what you see is that the mutations that are selected by a Darwinian process are ones that break genes that were already there. There are other malaria mutations that have been selected. One is called thalassemia, where the gene for one of the strands of hemoglobin is broken so that it doesn't produce normal hemoglobin in the blood. And for some reason that nobody quite understands, that gives a degree of immunity to malaria. And another one breaks a gene called glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. And again, nobody knows why that helps, but it does, somehow affecting the interior of the red blood cell where the malarial parasite lives when it invades a human. So you had to advance science far enough to be able to understand what was happening. Back in Darwin's day, people would see that some natives of countries that had malaria had this wonderful resistance to the disease, and European explorers would go in and drop like flies because they'd get malaria and die. So you'd say, hey, this is marvelous, but they didn't understand what was going on. And it's only been surprisingly recently, in the past 20 years or so, since the turn of the millennium, that science has been able to look at the mutations, the changes in DNA that are needed for many of these classic helpful mutations. And you have to do that because it turns out a mutation is a change in a molecule, a change in DNA or in the proteins, the molecular machinery that the DNA codes for. And again, surprisingly, many of the beneficial mutations that people have pointed to have turned out to be degradative mutations, ones that break or degrade the pre-existing genetic information that was there. And what's more, we've discovered since the 1950s that the cell is run by molecular machines, really complex, intricate things that have all these elegant controls and mechanisms and so forth. The genetic code is, of course, always associated with information and a mind. So in recent years, modern science has provided the data that shows that a mind, an intelligent agent, was behind life. There certainly can still be accidents and things like the sickle hemoglobin mutation, but 99.999% of life would have required purposeful planning, purposeful, intelligent design.
You use the word elegant, and that's intriguing. How have your studies brought you closer to understanding the grandeur of God and His creation?
Well, that's a good question. And as I mentioned earlier, I went to parochial school and I went to Catholic high school. And I was raised in a Catholic family, and I've always believed in God. But I was taught Darwin's theory in grade school and then in high school too. And we was taught a kind of a theistic evolutionary type of understanding of life, that, well, God made the laws of the universe and knew that they would give rise to folks like us, and that's our best understanding of how life arose from science. Nonetheless, if God wants to create us through secondary causes versus primary or something, who are we to say otherwise? And that always sounded just fine to me. I'm no theologian, and so it sounded good to me. And so I have always, been a practicing Catholic. I've always seen the force of philosophical and other arguments for God. But as you might imagine, when you see something called a bacterial flagellum, which is a literal outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. If you read about things like the photosynthetic reaction center in plants, where there are these enormously complex systems to take a photon of light and capture the energy in it, and it's like a bucket brigade where the first step is to send an electron from one carrier to another carrier, and from there to another, and there are protons, acid, which is pumped out as the result of it's
marvelous.
Exactly, a marvelous system. And when you find out that the great majority of hype behind Darwin's theory was pretty much a Potemkin village, that everybody assumed that, but nobody had any evidence. And so you go back and see that all of this stuff required planning to an extreme degree. when that starts to bring home to you the wisdom and power and majesty of God, and that God is interested or responsible for details of life and presumably much else that you didn't even know were there, and probably ones that you still don't know are there or have been planned by Him and brought to fruition by Him. So, yeah, it certainly affects your understanding of God.
I'd like to ask you to help college students who may be entering the classroom for the first time and or in a classroom setting where they're taught Darwin and they're not exactly sure what to say. What would be your recommendation for them? Like, what would be a good way for them to show that they're not sold on Darwinian evolution, and how would you suggest they respond to that?
Well, that's a tricky question, because Darwin's theory is kind of a shibboleth, or an important symbol, oftentimes in the culture wars in our society. So that if you just indicate that, well, you're a little skeptical of Darwin's theory, people will become hostile. Not everybody, but some people will mark you out as you are on the other side. And so
suddenly the open-mindedness vanishes.
Well, it was never there in the first place. I would recommend, first of all, that if you're going to express skepticism, that you know what you're talking about. And so you have to read and understand the subject. You should also, going in, realize that there's a lot of loose talk when it comes to how life arose. People will say life evolved, and you press them on how we know a Darwinian mechanism or random processes is responsible. They'll back off. They'll say, well, we're still working on the mechanism of how life evolved, but hey, look, there were dinosaurs, and here's some fossil bones. So you have to separate the idea of evolution, you can call it mere evolution, from the idea of Darwin's theory. In mere evolution, by that I mean the idea of common descent, that organisms today might be related through birth and death and change from organisms in the distant past. But it doesn't say how in the world such fantastic things could change. Doesn't say where the ancestors came from. It pretty much says, well, yeah, we started here we are now. Don't know how that happened. Okay, that's fine, and as far as I can see, that's quite compatible with understanding the need for guidance and intelligence in developing life. Darwin's claim to fame was not to propose evolution in that sense. There were other naturalists who lived before him who had talked about evolution and the ladder of life and increasing aspects of being and so forth. With those other folks, the progression of life was always teleological. There was a purpose, there was something driving and guiding it and so on, which pretty much everybody understood to be God. But Darwin's claim to fame was that he thought he proposed a mechanism, a mindless mechanism, that just by playing out and having these accidents, mutations, and natural selection over time could explain the very intricate features that were known even back in his day, like the eye with very many mechanisms, and it was known since antiquity that the eye was really an impressive feature. So that was his claim to fame. He says that these systems and elegant and complex features of life could arise without the input of any intelligence, without any guidance, especially from God. He made it clear in his correspondence that if God had to have a role in explaining any of this, then he would care nothing for his theory. So he was not, he rebuffed a couple of fellow scientists who had written letters suggesting a theistic interpretation of his mechanism, that, well, yes, this can happen, but of course we know that some of the random changes were actually guided by God. He said, forget about that. He says, that's not what I mean. And that's certainly not what it's taken to mean today. So when you go in the classroom, you have to keep in mind the distinction between different senses of the word evolution. Change over time, well, we see change over time. Common descent, well, there's evidence for that. There's problems with it, but it's not, in my view, it's kind of trivial because it doesn't explain anything. Where 99% of the philosophical and scientific importance of Darwin's theory arises is in the claim that random changes, unguided changes, filtered by natural selection, can get the job done. And by random, we mean, again, unguided, unplanned by anyone, including God.
By the way, can you give us a quick synopsis of your latest book, Darwin Devolves?
Darwin Devolves is my third book. And the first one was called Darwin's Black Box. It kind of described the molecular machinery of the cell, or some examples of it, and showed why it's resistant to Darwin's mechanism, because it's irreducibly complex, can't be put together gradually, and why it's a good indication of design, because the parts are arranged for purposes, and we know that minds have purposes. And the other book, the second book, I'll skip over that. But the third book, and I've written all these books as the field has advances, as biochemistry has discovered more and more about the molecular foundation of life. The third book involves the question of just what are these mutations that are involved in helpful changes in organisms. It's been known for a long time that if you grow bacteria for a while, they start to grow faster and they can go better, and say, oh, hey, that's pretty cool. And again, I mentioned earlier, European travelers would come to the tropics and see that the folks, natives there, had resistance to diseases that the Europeans, didn't, and say, wow, that's a great improvement in our health. But until recently, nobody knew exactly what were the changes in DNA that underlie these abilities. And you have to go to that level. I stress in my books that you have to look at the molecular level of life, because that's where the rubber meets the road in biology. DNA is a molecule. DNA contains information in genes to instruct the machinery of the cell to make proteins, and essentially a code to make the proteins, which are the parts of the molecular machinery of the cell. So a change in the DNA changes the instructions to make the molecular machinery, results in a different machine, which can affect the shape or the metabolism of an organism. So you got to know what those changes are. And it's only been in the past 20 years that new laboratory equipment and new computer equipment and advances in computer speeds have kind of come together to allow scientists to sequence every single unit, every single what's called nucleotides of DNA in an organism. some older folks, if you ask your parents, the audience asks their parents, they might remember in the year 2000 that then President Clinton and Prime Minister Tony Blair of the United Kingdom jointly announced that the entire human genome had been sequenced, and that was a huge milestone. But it took decades and billions of dollars. Well, just like the earliest computers were big and clunky and expensive, but now they're really fast, really cheap, and so on. Same thing with sequencing. You know, you can sequence a human genome or somebody's genome, you know, in a day these days. And the genomes of all sorts of organisms, bacteria, bears, dogs, plants, corn, viruses, you name it, is a lot easier and quicker. And so you can track down changes in the DNA, and you can track down the ones, it's still hard, but you can at least do it these days, you can try, track down the ones that are responsible for beneficial mutations. And it turns out that the great majority of them break pre-existing genes or degrade, you know, decrease their ability to do what they have done. And it turns out that can be beneficial in some circumstances. And when I explain this to people, they ask, you know, how can it be beneficial to break something? Well, and I say, well, you know, imagine that your car, you had a real nice car, maybe a DeLorean from, you know, Back to the Future or something, the movie Back to the Future, or a fancy car. But due to some strange circumstance, your life depended on your car getting better gas mileage. So what's the quickest way you could get better gas mileage? Well, you can take those doors and you could take them off, break them off and throw them away. And you take the hood and throw it away, and spare tire, throw it out. And because of the decreased weight, now it gets better gas mileage. You know, doors and hoods and so on are useful, but if your life depended on right now getting better gas mileage, then throwing those things away is the way to go. And in the book, I show a number of examples of just that going on. And it turns out that wherever we have been able to track down mutations that seem to be responsible for changes, noticeable changes, they've been degradative. I'm sure most students have run across Darwin's finches, the Galapagos finches, as examples of evolution. Everybody knows there's about a dozen different species of them on these islands, Galapagos Islands, which are about 500 miles west of Ecuador. And the idea that is that maybe sometime in the misty past, a couple of finches were blown by a storm or something out onto these islands. They, kind of liked it there, and they settled down, and they divided into species over a couple million years. That's interesting. And, but some of them are, larger than others, maybe twice the size. Some have thinner beaks, some have thicker beaks, and they eat different food and so on. Well, it was about 5 years or so ago, a Swedish team went down there and they got blood samples from the birds from each of the species, each of the 12 species, and they sequenced the entire genome. And the genome of the bird is roughly about a billion nucleotides. So they sequenced, I think it was actually, they had 100 samples from the bird, so they had 100 billion nucleotides worth of sequence. And so you can't do this by hand. You have to enter the data into computers and use computers to compare things. But the long and the short is that the difference between the sharp-beaked birds and the blunt-beaked finches is that there's a gene in the blunt-beaked ones which is broken or degraded, can't work as well as it used to. How does that help? Well, if there's a gene that helps control facial development, and in birds it helps a beak grow long and thin, well, if you break it, maybe the beak will be, shorter and thicker, doesn't achieve the same shape that it did before. And maybe that helps. For example, in the drought, these big-beaked birds could eat tougher seeds that survived the drought, and the other ones couldn't and died. Maybe that does help, but it doesn't explain how you get the gene in the first place. It doesn't explain how you build things in the first place. So this book essentially says that, yeah, all of these examples, or many of them, are true, but they're the result of devolution rather than evolution, breaking stuff that's already there rather than making stuff. But nobody cares about how you can break genes. The question about how life diversified and achieved all of the fantastic things that we see is how you can construct it in the first place.
So there had to have been a prototype. Would you,
Yeah,
is that the right
that's
way?
right.
Like a prototype that then gave rise to variations within a
Exactly.
prototype.
Exactly. Turns out that if you start with a generic finch, somewhere in the forests of South America, well, maybe, if it gets blown this way and it finds itself in a different environment, maybe it can lose some traits. And by losing them, it helps adapt it to that specific environment. So you lose a gene that makes your beak longer and thinner, but now you can survive in a tougher environment. If you lose a different set of genes, maybe you'll grow bigger. Maybe the controls that tell your growing body to stop growing, maybe they get damaged and they get bigger. And I talk about a number of examples of dog breeds, which are oftentimes pointed at by evolutionists saying, look at, what selective breeding has wrought in just a couple hundred years. But in the past 10 years, a lot of scientists were interested in these dog breeds too, simply because they wanted to say what genes are involved in the differences between Dachshunds and Great Danes and so on. The great majority of ones are broken genes. So if you want a Chihuahua, you can break the genes that help legs grow longer and bodies grow bigger. And there are dogs that are really thickly muscled, and that's due to the breaking of a control gene called myostatin that tells the body when to stop growing muscles. And dogs that have different fur colors, they're generally broken genes involved in that. You can't make a pigment anymore. And if you think about it, that's a wonderful example of evolution, because if in the wild some circumstances said, well, shorter-legged dogs would have an advantage over here, the quickest way to get short legs would be to break the gene that makes your legs longer, rather than try to wait for a new machine which would somehow do the same thing, because it of course takes a lot longer to build something that's invariably going to have a lot of parts than just to break something. And if in another circumstance it says, well, let's get a really big dog, you can break the controls that tell it when to stop growing. So you can really guide the development of organisms in a number of different directions by breaking stuff they already have rather than making new stuff. So in my estimation, this is the death knell of Darwin's theory. Simply because it shows that, yeah, this random mutation and natural selection is real. It certainly is true, and it operates on genes. But just statistically, it's a lot easier and faster to break a gene than to make one. And by doing so, you can change an organism in a lot of different ways, which would likely be compatible with a new environment or successful in a new environment. So Darwin's mechanism itself is powerfully devolutionary. Who would have thought it, back in the day? But yeah, Darwin's mechanism itself degrades the genome over time. So it is not the answer to the question of where did all this amazing stuff come from in the first place.
So I think it's safe to say that it's okay to doubt Darwin, that the death knell has been sounded, that Darwin's theory is outdated and inadequate.
That's correct. As a matter of fact, a little known fact, whenever you read about evolution in the newspapers or see it on TV shows, they always talk about Darwin's mechanism. But Darwin's ideas are kind of out of favor in the biology community as a whole these days. I would estimate that 1/4 to 1/3 of biologists themselves don't think Darwin's theory is the complete answer. And other people have been proposing other factors which might have affected the development of life. And the name for this is called the extended evolutionary synthesis. And I won't go into it, but in my book, Darwin Devolves, I have a couple chapters discussing these other mechanisms, and they explain a thing or two here or there, but they are not the overarching explanation that is needed to explain the development of life. So for somebody who's not in the field, you're in good company if you doubt Darwin's theory. And if you just say, I doubt Darwin's theory, I think there must be something else, you'll do fine in academia. The third rail, or the dividing line between permissible and impermissible thinking, is if you say, I think intelligence was required. I think something, else, not randomness, but intelligence was behind the development of life. And that is the dividing line. So plenty of people criticize Darwin's theory, but intelligent design is still viewed as beyond the pale in academia, even though you talk to the man on the street and everybody thinks that's right. The case.
This took a designer and an intelligence. The creator of the universe has to be a master designer. It's so complex.
You bet, yeah. And the key is the more science knows, the more stunningly obvious that becomes. Back when a lot less was known about life or the universe, scientists thought it wasn't all that big of a deal. Back in Darwin's day, not only did people not know about molecules and cells, but physicists and astronomers thought that the universe was eternal and that it was kind of bland and that the Earth was no big deal and there's probably life on every other planet, around because, hey, it would arise by a Darwinian process anyway. So the more we know, the more physics and astronomy has advanced, the more we see that the universe as a whole is fine-tuned, stunningly fine-tuned for life. And the more we know about biology, the more we see the amazing complexity and intricacy and purpose in all of the parts of life, starting from the foundation of life. So unlike the popular misconception, the more science knows, the more that it points to the need for a cause beyond the material universe for an explanation of what we find in the universe.
And therefore it makes a lot of sense to believe that God created everything.
Absolutely. That's certainly what I think. And that's what, Thomas Aquinas and all the fathers of the church and so on said. They say, hey, look, a living system, it's like a boat being made by a master builder, but it's even better because the instructions or the ability is within the body of the organism itself. And so Aquinas likened life to design stuff and the need for a mind to put it all together.